Gerai, tai tęsiame konferenciją toliau.
We will continue our conference now, and I would like to introduce to you the third speaker, Dr. Daumantas Stumbrys, who is the Doctor of Science in Sociology, and he works at the Department of Sociology at VILNIUS University. And I would like to continue what was being said. We have many representatives of various positions at this conference, and Daumantas Stumbrys can do a lot and help us understand what problems we can see in this area. And Daumantas will be speaking about alcohol and suicidality in Lithuania, and there will be many insights that we will hear from him. Daumantas, when you are ready, we are ready to listen to you. Hello. I would like to welcome everyone who has connected to this conference today. I will make a presentation which will be lengthy about alcohol and suicidality in Lithuania. My presentation is called about population level data and men's life stories. How did I start researching this area? And why do I have this presentation? 15 years ago, I started writing my thesis about mortality caused by alcohol and the mortality differences among men, and a lot of data at the level of population, and I speak about the mortality data in Lithuania. There were various representative surveys, and they showed a huge damage caused by alcohol impacting mortality and suicidality. And suicide rate in Lithuania was one of the highest in the world. And in my research, I saw certain trends and differences, demographic ones, and I had a question: why has this happened? Why do we have these differences? Because when you see those differences, you can't see what lies behind them, because I see certain social differences and gender-based differences. So I went into the micro level and carried out the quality analysis, that is men's life stories. I researched that after I wrote my thesis, doctoral thesis, and I tried to analyze how life stories, what are the life stories of men's, and tried to draw certain conclusions at the national Lithuanian level. This is not research, but it has helped me understand certain things. This presentation is based on the research of my colleagues too. This is an overview of my own and colleagues' research based on relevant publications on suicide and alcohol harm. The research in that area, and I have certain colleagues and my mentors and co-authors who have helped me carry out this research. These are Professor Jasulionis, Tambutienė, Mindaugas Štelemėkas, and Mr. Puris. And of course, all this research would not have been possible without support, and the Lithuanian Research Council has funded loss of that. So my presentation is will consist of these of the following topics. First of all, what does population level data show? That's the suicide rates and changes, the harms of alcohol consumption, the association between alcohol consumption and suicide. And in my second part of this presentation, I will speak about men's life stories. That will be based on a book I recently issued, which is based on this qualitative research. And there are such uh, such topics as alcohol consumption and practices, and alcohol, mental health, and suicidal behavior. I will start with a few slides. What does the recent suicidality data show? And I would like to mention the context at the beginning of this presentation. I will start with women, although the presentation about men's suicide, very often women remain secondary in the area of suicidality, but this is very important. You see here the blue line demonstrating the absolute rate of cases, and then you see the case rate per thousand inhabitants. We see that the reduction is double in absolute figures within 20 years. This is very important for me, especially as I work in the demographic area. And speaking about the suicides among women, what is important is that when we lose lives, women's lives, when we speak about the women's suicide, this is not only a loss of life, but also the unborn children who could have been born, especially if we speak about young women or middle-aged women. So we only speak about the lost life, but we forget about the lost demographic potential. Of course, women's suicide rate is 4 times less than men's. In the next slide, you will see men's suicide rates. They are much higher, but the progress is also significant. We see that the suicide rate has dropped by almost 3 times. We had a certain stagnation period from 2005 to 2013. This coincided with the economic recession and other macro level aspects and processes. However, the result is positive. And to finish, it's important to state that Lithuania has is among the top countries in Europe and the world by suicide indicators, and we are side by side with Hungary, Slovenia, and others. Now, briefly, I would like to speak about the demographic losses or the lost potential years of life. This sounds like a difficult indicator, but it's important that we take into consideration the age of the diseased person and what was the potential life years that the person has lost. So the younger the person who dies of suicide, the more potential years of life we lose. And we can speak, we can compare that with other countries as well. We see progress in other countries, in Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. They are similar, but ultimately the result remains similar to the one at the beginning. That is, we have the highest suicide rate and we lose the largest number of potential years of life to compare it to the Baltic countries. What is another important aspect when we speak in general about mental health and demographic changes? If we speak about the demographic losses, we mostly concentrate on suicides or the use of alcohol and the mortality caused by that. But then we forget about other external death reasons which are related to the mental health and the use of psychoactive substances. There are certain external reasons as violence or accidents and so on, or homicides. This is an important aspect. The research conducted by my colleagues and myself concentrate on the socio-economic differentiation, and we tried to analyze where the suicide risk is the highest. It's among middle-aged women, but we also see the indicators at the level of the whole of population, and we have the data of mortality based on the national census. And that shows the differences of the whole population. So we see that the risk of suicide is higher among the lower social stratum or the less educated people or socially excluded people. If, for instance, an individual occupies a higher post, then the suicide rate is lower. Then the marital status is also affects people if people are married or unmarried. So when people are married, this is the statistic about men, but women's statistics is the same. So if people are married, then the suicide rate is lower than when people are not married. Another indicator is the nationality. We have two bigger ethnic groups in Lithuania, the Russians and the Poles. We see that the risk for the Lithuanians is lower. This research was carried out by the risk for the Lithuanian population is higher, and we involved in this research all nationalities. And then rural versus urban, we see that the suicide rate in the rural area is higher. And the indicator shows that in sparsely inhabited areas, the risk of suicide is higher because we have such regions in Lithuania with low density, with one person households, and the risk of suicide is higher there.
One more trial, more a study published recently. We studied what is the relation with the suicide risk relation to unemployment, to marital status of these men in the particular municipality, or for example, the level of education. And we see that if you are employed or you are unemployed, but you live in an area where the unemployment rate is high, your suicide risk is higher. The same is true about the marital status. Whether you are married or unmarried, but you live in an area where there are many unmarried men with lower education, or the unemployment situation is worse, your suicide risk is higher. In other words, the municipalities or the regions that have more problems, or where the socioeconomic situation is worse, the suicide risk goes higher. The education level, the higher the education level, the lower the suicide risk. But still, if you live in a municipality with all these socioeconomical issues, your suicide risk is higher. These are the interesting results of this study. Now we will go to the harm of alcohol use. We leave the suicide risk apart, and we will speak about alcohol and its harm. I've been working on several studies about the alcohol use and about the policies that have to do with alcohol use and their efficacy. Here you see the data, the pre-pandemic data. Does this alcohol harm go down, or goes it down, or it doesn't go down? When we speak about the alcohol harm, the amount consumed is the most important point that is being discussed. But in sociology, we usually speak about the possible illnesses and the death statistics. If a person has died from alcohol use, this is a clear evidence of the harm of alcohol. And alcohol use and alcohol use policies. Here we also speak about the deaths that have to do with alcohol use. The cardiovascular diseases that have to do with alcohol use and other death reasons. We had the year 2007, and from then we saw a very evident fall in alcohol use and alcohol harm. 60% in men. Other statistics, the potentially lost years of life, this figure also dropped almost twice in the same period. Population level data, both for men and for women, show that the alcohol harm that we see in the long term, if we speak about 10-15 years, this harm is dropping. This figure is dropping. Other important point is the context. It's important to speak about our position in our context. I have already spoken about the study where we spoke about the potentially lost years of life because of alcohol and drug use. It is very important to note that the absolute number of deaths are because of the use of alcohol, not drugs. Our starting point was the year 2007, and we see that Lithuania was very different, not only in Europe, not only in the world, but also in the among the Baltic states. We had very high numbers of alcohol harm or deaths related to alcohol use, and the lost years of life. This figure was also the highest. During this study period, we see a very huge progress. We see that we are now in front of Estonia and Latvia, countries with which we usually compare ourselves. This is good. And in my studies, in the studies of my colleagues, we see that these positive processes, as far as the use of alcohol is concerned, have to do with the alcohol control policies. Representative interviews or polls from them, we see that the alcohol use is dropping and the alcohol harm figures are dropping. And this process is a very positive process, and we can be proud of it, especially having in mind the time perspective and other perspectives. If we speak about the alcohol use harm to others, is this harm diminishing? The answer would be yes, it is diminishing, but I am missing, me, myself, and my colleagues, we are missing this question about the alcohol use harm for others in the political agenda. The political agenda and the political solutions are related to the well-being of the alcohol user. We speak about their psychological problems, psychosocial problems, physical health, mental health. But we do not speak about the harm of alcohol use for the others, the emotional harm.
It's not only about the emotional harm, but also about the property damage and homicide and other damage. Sometimes we oversee that. Probably this is not the proper term to use, but we should speak about the strategic documents. If we take into consideration alcohol prevention or drug protection prevention documents, strategic documents, you would see that damage towards others takes very little place, or in general it's undermined. Most attention is concentrated on other aspects. So in this graph, you see the data gathered by questionnaires, but the questions are: did you experience any physical damage? Were you being kept awoke at night? And Were you annoyed by people vomiting, and so on, and at least one other harm? And the representative survey shows that at the moment, the number of individuals who have experienced at least one of the harms has been declining, not significantly, but the difference was recorded statistically, which is important. On the other hand, if you see how many people experience that damage, we see that the indicator amounts to 70%, which is quite high. Another research that we have recently publicized is children related to the individuals living with the individuals consuming the damaging amounts of alcohol. And here we speak about the damage to children's emotional health if there are family members who consume harmful amounts of alcohol. The Lithuanian data was compared to that of other 20 countries, and what we have been able to establish was that the share of children living with individuals consuming harmful amounts of alcohol was the highest among all those countries and accounted for 35%. How did we establish that? We had four control questions. For instance, did it ever happen that you don't remember what you were doing yesterday evening? That is when you were using alcohol. And a few other questions. So if children live in that environment where there are adults who don't remember what they were doing in the evening, it is very likely that they are living in a risky environment. That damage is declining. However, it should be emphasized once again that it is not concentrated on enough, especially when we're speaking about damage towards others. Let's move on. It's our recent data of individuals who were drunk, and these are violence orders, violence warrants. You know that as of July 2023, police officers are able to obtain violence warrants, and an individual is ordered to move out of the place where they are potentially violent. Within 8 months, quite a number of violence warrants violence orders were issued, approximately 14,000. This is a huge number. When a violence warrant was issued, 54% of individuals causing harm, causing risk or threats were drunk and intoxicated by alcohol, and the average percentage of blood of alcohol in blood was 2.33 milliliters, and other countries had a significantly lower average, 0.4 milliliters. Let's move on. I talked about the overall mental health situation, about alcohol consumption and suicide rate. We have quite a number of population level data relating those two aspects, namely the use of alcohol and suicides. First of all, we have the research carried out by my colleagues that analyzed the intersection data, and they were researching how many people died as a result, at the moment of death, they were intoxicated by alcohol, and that was based on the medical dissection data. So it shows that 58% of those who died by hanging themselves were intoxicated by alcohol. And we also see that approximately half of individuals at the moment of suicide are intoxicated. And this research gives the average number of alcohol concentration in blood, milliliters. Now, another aspect is the violence warrants or orders. And when a violence warrant is issued, there are special questionnaires to be filled out. There are questions on violence and dependencies, addictions, and there is a question whether a dangerous person had threatened suicide or is threatening suicide. And it's a large part, approximately 28% of those who were aggressive had threatened suicide. Very often it remained at the threat level only, but nevertheless, this group of individuals is quite significant. And here we can do certain interventions because they are identified. And it is also important to note that those individuals not only threaten violence against themselves, but also against their next of kin. And they not only cause a threat and risk, but also sudden emotional consequences, especially to children. And we tried to determine how many cases there are when these individuals live with children or children see such cases. And in 27%, children live with those dangerous individuals or participate in those situations. To summarize part one, what does the population level data show? First of all, alcohol-related mortality is quite high, but the situation is improving. These changes are often related to the alcohol control policy, but with the generation change, the practices of alcohol consumption also changes, and with a new generation, we have a different level of alcohol consumption. Regarding suicide rate, they are falling. And when we compare ourselves to Europe and the world, we see that the suicide is still very frequent and suicide rate is very high among both men and women. But of course, there's an undoubtedly there is a relationship between suicide and other violence, and very often it is related to alcohol consumption. And of course, if we take the homicide data, it's the same thing. Today, this year, we have a research where we are analyzing together with the colleagues the relation among convicts and the homicides, and we see that 50% of those convicts that committed homicide were under alcohol influence. What about men's life stories? I analyzed how their lives influence their conduct. We we conducted one research, and it was published as a book. You can download it free of charge on the internet or buy a paper version. So we have the following insights about men using alcohol, and in the second part I will show you a few pictures by the photographer Bon Alog. This research was a challenge to me. I would like to thank those men who have agreed to talk to me about their life stories. And the challenge was because it's difficult to find the individuals using alcohol. And of course, some of them are within my social bubble, but as regards the other part, I went to the villages and would stand up at 10 o'clock would keep standing at 10 o'clock by a shop, countryside shop, and people would come at 10 o'clock to buy alcohol, and then I tried to speak to those individuals, and that made an impression on me as a researcher. And I talked to those men over there. So I will review the main topics that I outlined during this conversation. How did it happen that those individuals became harmful alcohol consumption and are under such a big damage or harm caused by alcohol? I will start with the alcohol consumption culture and practice. Often it is related to the Soviet heritage and the concept of masculinity and virility. That is, if you want to be a real man, you have to be using alcohol. That is, this is a quality of a real man. That was the understanding. And that was the cause of the early alcohol consumption. When individuals started consuming alcohol at an early age, and people would say the following: my first attempt to drink alcohol was very simple. I was in the 4th grade. We finished primary. I was at the primary school, and when we finished it, the primary school, well, we bought some beer and we drank 6 bottles, and among the 12 of us, and that was it, and we were called men. So the consumption of alcohol happens everywhere, at work, schools. Men were telling me in their stories how they consumed alcohol in schools, and even teachers would serve them as alcohol as a gift, especially when they were older. That was the usual practice.
Another important point is critical life events. Here we can speak about alcohol consumption as both as a reason and as a result. here as a consequence. Here we have two topics. The men say that they would consume alcohol, and this alcohol consumption was the reason for their divorce, for their unemployment, for their health issues, for other critical events in their lives. A part of men with whom I spoke said that several critical events became as a reason to drink. Death of next of kin or divorce, unemployment. And when you live in such society where alcohol consumption practices are very common, when you face a critical event in your life, you start drinking more. For example, unemployment. When you lose your job, if you used to drink 2 bottles of beer each evening, so when you are unemployed, you have lost your job, you can also drink a bottle of beer in the morning because you do not need to go to work. So here we have, for example, one of the examples, or I suppose it's not one of them. When I lost my home, I started drinking, but I'm not the only one who has done that. So here we see this despair in facing a critical event in one's life. Alcohol, crime, and social control. Some of these life stories were full of dramas, criminal events, stories that had to do with crime. Some of them told me that they were in prison for some time, and different experts also dwelled on this topic. Here in Lithuania, we have a rather harsh violence culture, punishment culture. If a person has committed a crime, he must be imprisoned. And I like these words of a judge. She said, "I don't know why there is such a thing in society's attitude. Why is it that all sentenced, everyone should be sentenced as severely as possible? Everyone should sit in prison. In our country, if a person has committed an offense, then we punish him for his acts, and he must be punished very harshly. So if a man does not meet the expectations of the society, he is not a real man, and he also faces some criminal events, you must be deleted from this world. You need to be imprisoned. Now, prison reform is being implemented. I'm very positive about this reform. The sentences should be shorter, because when we speak not only with these men, also with experts, judges, we see that the punishment system is not a good one, is not functioning well. We do not have enough empathy, and we want to punish in the severest way the people who do not meet the norms. Alcohol, mental health, and suicidal behavior. These situations were really difficult, complicated, and once I spoke with a person in a overnight stay. It was not in Vilnius, so I went to an overnight stay and spoke with 3 men who had some mental health issues. They had lost their families, and this experience for me personally was a rather complicated one. I'm not a psychologist myself. I do not have experience to listen to such life stories, dramatic life stories. It was a burden for me. This tension, this stress that these people experience because of the social pressure, because of their complicated lives. They said, I feel tension. I know what is the medicine for this. And here we have the words of one of them. When I'm really sad and when I feel hopeless, well, I feel absolutely powerless. I feel absolutely powerless against alcohol and I don't even try to resist it. They feel some kind of stress, both the addiction and the social tension. In such a case, alcohol is an easy medicine, an easy way out. We also see the problem of availability of services, mental health services, not only services that have to do with addictions, addiction treatment, but also sessions for mental health. And here we had another topic, alcohol and suicide, and the stigma topic. It seems like the society approves alcohol use, alcohol consumption. It's a norm to consume alcohol, but people who have some mental health issues, because of that, they feel stressed. So it's a paradox. It's normal to consume alcohol. Everybody drinks, but if you have problems because of that, so it's not my business. Stay with your problems. Don't make them public. You must drink. You should be a man. You should not have any problems because of drinking. So this is the stress that they are experiencing. And during the interview, these men spoke about their health issues, about their despair, about economical difficulties, psychosociological stress because of the family that they have lost. And here in this conversation, we see a very interesting experience. This man told me that he lost his relatives because they committed suicide. This conversation was a very difficult one. It was difficult to hear this story. And he says, well, it was hard, not that it was hard, but because I found my uncle who committed suicide and his cousin also committed suicide. But at the end, he said, yes, they committed suicide, but I am strong. So, summarizing, what do we see from these life stories? We see that we live in a culture of harmful alcohol consumption, which is normal, seen as normal. Alcohol consumption is seen as a part of being a man, of masculinity. And the elderly man and the middle-aged generation lives in this culture. On the other hand, we live in a punishment culture, stigma culture. On the one hand, we see alcohol consumption as a normal thing. On the other hand, if you cannot cope with alcohol consumption, we want to punish you and to put you away. And the critical life events is a very important point. Critical life events can be both the result and the reason for alcohol consumption, and the lack of services. Lack of services was mentioned by experts, but also by some of the men. That was it. Thank you for your attention. Here we have some literature sources. And now, if you have any questions, I am more than glad to answer. Thank you, Daumantas, for your presentation, a very lengthy and interesting one. It was very, very interesting to listen to you as a researcher. You do not look for an easy questions or for an easy groups to be studied. And most probably because of this, we have so many questions. I think that only some of them can be answered in the time that we have left. I will start by several questions that are in common.
Does the decline in alcohol consumption transfer into the increase of the use of other psychotropic substances like drugs, and whether does it cause more damage? That is, the participants mentioned that it's mostly among the young generation, the alcohol consumption declines, but it may be that this abuse of substances, other substances, increases. Would you comment on that? The answer is, I have I have gained some knowledge about that, this hypothesis. That is, if the consumption of alcohol becomes illegal, it will be replaced by the consumption of other substances. But this is not relevant because alcohol consumption is not illegal. If we take a specific group, that is 18, 19-year-olds who cannot obtain alcohol as the law which was adopted a few years ago, despite that, these are different regulation levels, because when you have a can of beer, and are an 18-year-old, you will not be criminally liable. But if you possess cannabis, you will be criminally liable. It may be in general related to the spread of drugs and in general other psychotropic substances. This trend is spreading among young people, but this has been happening for 3 decades. Is this related to alcohol consumption control measures in which were valid for the last 3 years? I really doubt that. Okay, our next question is namely related to the alcohol consumption control measures. At the beginning, you were showing various graphs related to the fact that mortality decreases, the mortality related to alcohol decreases. Something happened in 2007 because there was a big decline in alcohol-related mortality. Can you contact on that? How is that decline related? What alcohol control measures were most efficient? I will give you a few aspects. First of all, we had the years of sobriety announced at our parliament for that year, and it encompassed a set of measures. But probably that was a breakthrough year when everything started, that is, increasing excise duties on alcohol, reducing accessibility, advertisement prohibitions, and so on. These were the main reasons, that is, increasing prices, decreasing accessibility, prohibition of advertising, and so on. So what we see is that after this year, we have had composite alcohol control measures targeting the population. So this alcohol control policy is based on evidence. It gives results, and we can see that this has been demonstrated by scientific research, and it gives the general decline of damage and harm, but it doesn't solve the issues of domestic violence, violence against women. It reduces the scope of domestic violence because people use less alcohol, but the systemic problem itself is not solved. It requires other measures. That's why I would like to see other measures implemented, not only those that are targeting the population, but also those that are targeting the solving of specific problems at the individual level and at the social group level, which are not easy to implement, for instance, banning advertising. On the other hand, this is quite simple, technically wise. On the other hand, there are certain lobbying groups that oppose that. And but fortunately, they did not give a lot of results. Okay, now post-pandemic research. You were presenting the trends before the pandemics. What about the post-pandemic period? During the pandemic, the data was changing. We saw the stagnation in consumption and the alcohol consumption related indicators like suicides or homicides. These indicators came to a stand, but let's wait for a couple of more years and for more comprehensive research. However, the signs, on the one hand, are concerning because we see the positive processes coming to a halt. On the other hand, there were a couple of years where certain changes were happening, but in the long term, they were not that significant. So that is my proposal, that we wait and see. And we have one more general question. Could you please name the essential things about men's suicides and women's suicides as well? It is obvious that on the one hand, this is a composite issue typical of many post-Soviet states. Very often we say that why is Lithuania so bad in this respect? But we are among the post-Soviet countries and among the other post-Soviet countries, for instance, the former Yugoslavian countries, we look more or less the same in that context. On the other hand, we are still distinguishable through our higher mortality rate. I don't know what I should say when we speak about men and women. Speaking about men, we have the distinguishable understanding of masculinity. We have the hegemonic understanding of masculinity, and we have even the phrase that being a real man is harmful to your health. But when we take women's mental health and suicide rate and alcohol consumption, it is, of course, much lower than men's. But if we take the context of other countries, it is still very high. So it's maybe not only the concept of masculinity that has the effect. It does, of course, but there are certain deeper questions in that at the level of macro-social or the overall empathy in our country. Are we able to empathize with each other, express sympathy? What is the stress level, psychosocial stress level? Do we accept each other? And if mistakes happen, do we want to punish people or remove people so that we don't see them? These and similar questions are very important when we speak about emotional health. Yes, indeed. And of course, we have lots of data showing that the suicidal ideation among men and women and the frequency of that ideation is more or less the same. So that's why when we speak about such variables as alcohol consumption, does it contribute to that? Because since suicidal ideation is more or less the same, at the same level among men and women, but men move to the further level of taking suicidal conduct. Yes, there's lots to talk about in this area, but thank you for what you have shared with us. That was very valuable. Thank you so much, Daumantas.